Hi everyone, my name is Devon Parris. I'm a fourth year student here at Sandbex. My racial justice leadership project is the Anti-Racist Film Review. Before I begin, I'd like to give a big thank you to everyone taking the time to view these speeches, and an even bigger thank you to the McKenna Center for establishing the Racial Justice Leadership Grants, as well as organizing the Friel talks. It is special to see a notable institution, like the McKenna Center, make space and support the voices of Black and Indigenous students on Sandbex's campus, and I'm sure other departments and sectors of this university would be wise to follow the footsteps you've helped establish here. As a member of the McKenna Center team for the past 6 months, I've been working on a series of film reviews that analyze and critique films about racism. Now, before I continue, I need to admit that yes, writing what is essentially a series of essays about movies may be the most English major way to talk about systemic racism. I've been thinking about this project over the last few days, and I know how this may all look at face value. Change is quickly coming, Sandbex students are finding their voices and holding the school accountable for their actions, and I'm out here talking about movies. But I would argue that there's more to film than what meets the eye. You see, movies don't just offer us action, romance, and sentimental moments, they also help shape discussions about social justice. Now, I'm in no way saying that films are the vanguard inspiring social change, but movies have a funny way of connecting with regular people and often reflect the mainstream ideas about contemporary issues. It's no surprise that Tate Taylor's The Help was the third most popular film on Netflix this past June, the month preceding George Floyd's murder and the protests it inspired. For those who are unfamiliar with racism, movies were a place to learn and understand the previously unknown. With that being said, the mainstream discourses in film do not always reflect what is just. For example, in 1915, D.W. Griffith released his infamous silent film, The Birth of a Nation, which was buoyed in part by its Southern revisionism of the Civil War's lost cause and deeply offensive portrayals of African Americans. In fact, when we adjust The Birth of the Nation's box office revenue for inflation, the film would rank as the sixth highest grossing film of all time at $1.8 billion, the reward it received for reflecting ideas and fears about African Americans in the early decades of the Jim Crow era. My point here is that values reflected in popular films that invoke race may not be the values needed to push for racial equity. The Birth of a Nation is a pretty extreme example, but it still depicted fears of African American barbitry in a time when organizations advocating for racial justice, like the NAACP, were developing and spreading influence. D.W. Griffith's film reflected a mainstream lost cause South that was fighting off the remnants of the Reconstruction era, but that flew in the face of radical pushes for Black tolerance. Movies about race today are not in the same realm of ignorance as The Birth of a Nation, but many are similar in that they reflect a mainstream idea about racism that does not do much work in forwarding the fight for racial equity. Movies like Green Book, The Help, and others became popular in the weeks and months after George Floyd's murder, but there are underlying issues in their messages. These films and their counterparts often avoid complicated, uncomfortable questions about institutional and structural oppression, and instead produce white savior narratives, use Black trauma as an exploitative source of drama, or oversimplify racism to an issue of mean individuals saying offensive things to Black people. Racism in Green Book, for example, is the mainstream, identifiable racism we all know. It's vulgar obscenities, physical abuse, and other acts of intimidation and violence that we view as reprehensible in 2021. It's the black and white understanding of racial oppression, when racial oppression really resembles shades of gray. Racial injustice in 2021 is not just overt racism through violence, verbal attacks, and terrible behavior, although unfortunately that still plays a huge role. It exists catastrophically yet covertly in every aspect of our lives. It's an economy that does not pay multiracial workers their worth and productivity, yet expects them to afford an ever-rising cost of living. It's in a criminal justice system that over-polices and sentences members of the Black and Indigenous community and the companies that profit off their imprisonment. It's in empty gestures of politicians who say they are on our side, yet support the very systems and policies that impress Black and Indigenous people. Most films about race do not capture these intricacies, however, so folks viewing them for educational purposes do not either. They capture the popular ideas about what racism is, but popular ideas often need to be radically tailored in order to amount to structural change. Unfortunately, there are plenty of films that take stances on more radical issues, although they are usually less popular. Boots Riley's Sorry to Bother You, Elliot Page's There's Something in the Water, and Carlos Lopez Estrada's Blind Spotting all examine the intricate functions of our racist society and seek to educate audiences with both the bleak realities Black and Indigenous peoples often face and new ideas that can help spark real change. Those films are out there, but they're hard to find when the green books and the helps are in the way. And that brings me back to my film review site. I think it's important to examine and highlight the groundbreaking ideas within films that examine the intricacies of racism, while also explaining why a lot of films about race are so bad at challenging racism in the 21st century. And that's what my website, the Anti-Racist Film Review, aims to do. It aims to be a place to discuss the anti-racism in films and to separate performative portrayals of racism from the informative. Every week we'll be uploading a new review to the site to inspect what each film has to say about racism, whether that be substantial or superficial. With that, there will also be a page that connects students to the Black Student Advisory and the Indigenous Student Advisory, along with resources from the regional branches of African and Scotian Affairs. Once again, I would like to thank the McKenna Center for providing Black and Indigenous students, like myself, with a platform to espouse our ideas, and thank you to everyone taking the time to hear the fantastic projects the Racial Justice Leadership Grant has inspired.
Thank you so much for coming and talking with us today. We just have a couple of questions to ask you. So what inspired you to take on this project?
Well, at the beginning of when the Black Lives Matter movement this past summer started kind of getting pretty big, I saw a lot of infographics on Instagram that were suggesting TV shows, books, and movies to watch. And a lot of these infographics had a lot of really bad movies about racism on there. I saw a lot of, I think Green Book was on there, I saw Help was on there, I saw Crash was on there, and Freedom Writers was on there too, and they all have really bad depictions of racism in my opinion. So I thought that it would be a good opportunity to kind of show why those movies don't do a very good job and maybe direct people towards movies that have really interesting ideas and things to say about racism.
And do you have a favorite movie of all time?
Actually, my favorite movies aren't about racism at all, or anything like that. I'm a big fan of Arrival. That's probably my favorite movie right now. And ever since I was 8, I love Titanic. And when I was 8, I used to watch Titanic on repeat and do that and obsess over that movie. So that's got to be an all-time favorite for me.
So what are the outcomes of your project? What do you hope to accomplish with this project?
I think the biggest goal for this project is to connect ideas that activists have been trying to get across about racism. So these broad institutional and structural changing ideas, like things about economic uplift, things like that are also in films, and connect that in a pretty easily accessible way through movie reviews. I know there's films like Sorry to Bother You and Sorry to Bother You, Get Out, Blind Spotting. All these films have pretty radical ideas that if you analyze them, kind of align themselves with what a lot of activists have kind of been saying for the past few years that will really help Black and Indigenous communities and kind of bring about more structural change. So I think connecting those ideas together and putting it in a pretty easily digestible form is kind of what I'm trying to aim for with this project.
Why is it important to think critically about the media that we expose ourselves to?
I think we're in a bit of a digital age now where there's so many sources of media that kind of come at us. And a lot of those sources of media are trying to get views, get profits, so there's a lot of sentimentalism and sensationalism that takes place over real concrete storytelling and actually fully explaining issues that people are trying to kind of bring to the forefront. So I think that critically analyzing them is a good kind of something good to do.
Why is it so important to hold Hollywood accountable for their work?
Hollywood's really bad at kind of making turning racism and these very serious issues into just sentimentalism. And I think that also plays a big role in people not really understanding what's going on with the Black Lives Matter movement and what people are really trying to kind of achieve through the Black Lives Matter movement. If you watch a film like Green Book or The Help, you think racism is just people using the N-word and being mean to Black people, when in reality it's a whole structural, institutional issue that they're trying to kind of come to terms with and that we're trying to kind of revolt against a little bit. So I think it really dumbs down the issue of racism a little bit in a way that doesn't really, so other people don't understand really what exactly is going on.
Why do you think culture plays an important role in the struggle against racism and race?
Yeah, culture has a really big role in disseminating ideas about how we kind of see the world a little bit. So I think if you want to look at how people view issues or how those issues are being portrayed, culture is a really good starting point to kind of get into that critique, get into how we kind of see the world around us.
What is the biggest change that you would like to see within the film industry?
I would hope that the film industry would take more truthful and more radical approaches to race and racism. I think that's something that I would like to see personally, but I doubt that's going to be a thing because what really sells in Hollywood is sentimentalism. So I hope that changes, but I don't have my hopes very high for it, unfortunately.
Can you give us an example of a movie that deals with racism but does more harm than good on the topic?
I would say Crash. That's one. It's funny because I used to love Crash when I was a little kid because I had this thing where I wanted to go see all the Best Picture movies and like kind of do all that. And Crash was one of the ones I liked a lot. And then I rewatched it about 2 years ago and I was like, oh my God, what's this? And I think what Crash does wrong is that Crash is about LA, it's about Los Angeles, and it's about the racial tensions in Los Angeles. And that's a very serious issue because Los Angeles is a big multicultural city that has a lot of unsimmering tensions that we've seen rise up in the past 30 years or so. But what it does there is that it kind of just, it's about all these different people and how like they kind of view like their race and how they view other races and like these underlying racisms. But it's just kind of, it doesn't dig into anything deeper, and it kind of just, everything goes over with this sentimental like, oh, like I understand you and you understand me and now everything's all right. When there's actually like some pretty serious structural issues that they could go into but they just don't. So that's why I would say that's a movie that doesn't really do a very good job.
So where do you see yourself in 5 or 10 years from now?
No idea. No idea. I'm not sure. I've had a couple ideas of what I want to do, but I kind of feel like I'm 11 and I'm like trying to see I'm like, I'm going to do this when I grow up. I'm going to do this when I grow up. I think maybe I'd like to do something in law and maybe do something within the criminal justice system and try and help out and try and kind of find a purpose for myself in there. But at the same time, I have no idea what I'm doing right now.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We learned a lot.